Emerging Rust GUI libraries in a WASM world. GUI in Rust progresses with unprecedented speed. 3 months in Rust GUI land is like 3 years in the mortal world. Herald.rurs was started almost exactly 5 years ago. That means it's been about 60 mortal years, and we still don't have a definitive solution to GIS.
That's because Rust GUI people are like Lispers and functional programmers, too obsessed with doing things correctly, from first principles and purity. For GUI programming, there is only one feature that matters: having a fuck ton of well-supported widgets for every situation across every platform. Almost everything else is secondary. This is why CSS, Flutter, and to a lesser extent Qt are so successful. No end user cares about data mutational elegance, when at the end of the day, somebody has to do the unsexy work to maintain and support each individual button, scroll bar, and toggle.
I'd argue that the most successful UI platform is a browser. And guess what? Browser does not have a fuck ton of well-supported widgets. All it does is some button with outdated UI, few inputs nobody really uses, and drop-down select suitable only for the most basic uses. Anything other built on divs with CSS and JS. And it works? So my opinion is that it's definitely solid foundations what matters. Rest will come with time from third-party libraries.
The browser is successful, not because it has a solid foundation, but because a ridiculous amount of engineering effort has been put into it. Most of the beautiful foundation you see are all post-2012. You young'uns don't remember the days before HTML5 and CSS3. Before NPM and PWAs and the cloud-native nonsense. Adobe Flash anyone. Silverlight. Before WebAssembly WebL Unity, yes, that game engine even required a browser plugin. Web browsers were often severely incompatible with each other, and web standards were a suggestion at best. Now it's bad form to slander dead people, so I will just say that the nice kind folks at Apple, under the orders of their dear leader, did their best to destroy as much of the pre-2012 web as possible by gatekeeping the iPhone browser and using their market power to strong-arm web technology.
Browser does not have a fuck ton of well-supported widgets. What are you talking about? HTML and CSS is full of widget libraries. It's the best cross-platform widget library out there. Ease of deployment plus reach is the driving force behind improving the platform. But at the present, nothing in Rust can even compare to something like Material UI. And let's not even go into stuff like date range picker components and shit, where companies probably spent millions in engineering effort to get them right, e.g. Airbub.
That's because Rust GUI people are like Lispers and functional programmers, too obsessed with doing things correctly, from first principles and purity. That's entirely wrong, and not necessary to paint swathes of developers like. Rust has numerous solutions for native GUIs. People ship apps with those stacks. Rust also has things like Tori, for when you don't want to deal with differences across platforms. Just because there's not one blessed solution, doesn't mean it's not possible to write UIs in Rust today.
It's not entirely wrong. Rust GUI has been held up by a significant dose of trying to do things properly, since the language definitely pushes you in that direction. It's taken so long because Rust insists on correctness and on an ownership model that the popular solutions for GIS simply didn't fit into. So it's taken time to come up with things that do work in those constraints.
Can you give an example of a real shipped app where the majority of the GUI is written in Rust? I'm excluding games because they tend to have trivial GUIs. I'm excluding Tori because the majority of the GUI code in a Tori app isn't Rust. This is a serious question. I'd love be shown I'm missing something. I read this article hoping to find out that a serious Rust GUI library was ready for real use, and was quite disappointed.
Would there ever be a definitive solution to GIS? Like some canonical, this is how you GUI in Rust. I mean, there are about 0 other languages where that has happened. How would Rust be any different? Just for in simple binary choices like immediate, retained, single cross-platform, markup non-markup, native non-native controls and so on, you'd quickly end up with end solutions that almost have to coexist, because some of those choices are deal breakers for some.
Searched for accessibility. 0 results. I couldn't see anything skimming down the page. Speaking as a Rust user, everyone in Rustland loves insulting Electron, but they have put some solid work into accessibility. In particular, Using WASM to draw text with Webble or Canvas instead of DOM may in the long term be one of the biggest steps back in accessibility ever.
What's wrong with TypeScript? Last time I checked, all WASM stuff was slower and much heavier than TS.js.
Slower. Not really now. Rust client web frameworks have improved. Don't have refs handy, but Leptos, Dioxys etc. are on a par with Solid. Larger bundle sizes. Yes, that's still true. And not all GUIs are web GUIs, so WASM isn't the whole story.
My understanding that WASM has a heavier load time, however actual benchmarks after the initial load are more impressive.
It's not WASM's fault. Rust produces large binaries for whatever reason, and people like to write their WASM in Rust. I've ported Rust to equivalent C, and it was 25% of the size, and similarly for loading times.
This may not be the message of the article, but as a side rant, I really don't understand the use case for a Rust-based guy. Rust's syntax, manual memory management, and compile times makes it seem like it's really not meant for this kind of workload, but instead for things like compilers, embedded systems, that kind of thing. I understand that not every UI needs to be a cross-platform blah blah blah, written in type of React scripts or a pixel-painted canvas written in Flutter. I also understand there's a use case for one-off UIs that may not target a browser. Let's compare it to something like Golang. Fast compile times, similar libraries, garbage collection. It seems like something more suited for UIs, where there are usually a lot more iterations. Worse performance for sure, but Rust also seems more than overkill in that regard for the UI use case.
From a Rustation's perspective, Golang is a no-go because it lacks enum types, sensible error handling, generics. I think it has some version of this now. Non-nullable types, or macros. Once you've gotten used to using these kinds of features in Rust, it is really annoying to go back and work in a language that lacks them. Basically, Golang takes such an opposite design approach to Rust that if you like Rust, you'll probably hate Golang. We also find that once you get used to the borrow checker, we mostly don't miss garbage collection. And garbage collection isn't a panacea either, as almost any large project still ends up with memory leaks caused by stray references. So basically we like Rust and think it's a well-designed language. It is quite frankly better as a language than any of the alternatives that we could be writing in. As such, it'd be nice if we could develop GUI applications in it.
If you're going to use Electron and all the bad that comes with it, why not just use TypeScript though?
Yeah, it seems to be a pretty niche use case. The learning curve for Rust is simply too high. My god, the syntax. You can just get much more done in less time with a web framework. I looked into Rust for writing games, including the UI frameworks, but found that the power it provides isn't really worth all the mental overhead. Most games don't really need that much power, particularly if you are using non-realistic graphics. In the event that you do actually need extra optimization, most engines let you hook down into C for raw performance.
The learning curve for Rust is simply too high. My god, the syntax. The syntax isn't even close to being a difficult part of the language, and it's something you get used to very quickly. The Rust syntax just isn't readable for people who don't yet know Rust, just like I find C difficult to read. You can just get much more done in less time with a web framework. Sure, you can also get it running even quicker in Python. But when it comes to maintenance, I prefer something where the type system wasn't just slapped on top. That said, the web does feel like the only fully featured and truly cross-platform guy at the moment.
This is a matter of familiarity. For example, Golang is claimed to have simple syntax, but I find Golang's syntax much harder to read than Rust. The fact they avoided keywords and symbols like a plague caused that now e.g. function signatures are mostly names, spaces and parentheses, and the meaning of them depends on their relative positions, which is something I'm not used to. I guess if I read Golang sources more frequently, that would become a second nature and would not slow me down. This is a matter of familiarity. No, it is not. Or at least not for everyone. I have learned several languages more unfamiliar to me than Rust, pure functional, logic, stack-oriented, etc., but none has given me the difficulties Rust has. Also, only my sample of course, but there are no reliable stats. No one I personally know who has gone through the Rust book has continued with Rust. The Rust Foundation hasn't made flattening the learning curve one of its 2024 goals because people don't find Rust harder than other languages. Many just do. A false universal doesn't become true through brute repetition.
Can I ask what kind of things you specifically found confusing about the syntax?
I wonder if Webpu could help with App GUI. I tried to understand how does it work, but it seems it's all about triangles. So it's not really clear if it has any benefit over plain canvas for standard UI approaches. I am betting on Vlong instead. Rust is too complicated for an average person, like me. It's basically the Haskell of system programming. 5 is basically Go made right. I remember looking into 5 last year. It seems most of the discussion surrounding it was that it was vaporware. Is that not the case? It certainly looks nice, but is it ready for use?
The main issue was that 5 promised automatic memory management like Rust, but without the trouble caused by the borrow checker, which is something anyone who knows about the problem more deeply would laugh at. Last I checked, they were still at the same stage as a few years ago with that. It will be working soon. It will almost certainly always stay there.